How the Red Army's gear shaped Nazi Germany's arsenal. The untold story. War is a crucible for innovation, where the stakes are sky high and engineers race to outdo each other with cutting-edge weapons. During World War II, both sides were scavenging for any edge they could get, and that meant studying the enemy's gear like it was the Holy Grail. If something worked better than your own stuff, you'd either copy it outright, tweak it to fit your needs, or at least borrow the big ideas. Today, we're diving into the wild world of how Nazi Germany looked to the Soviet Union's Red Army for inspiration, nabbing ideas from their tanks, guns, and more. But not everything you've heard about this is true. There's a ton of myths out there, and I'm here to set the record straight with a mix of hard facts, economic insights, and my own take on what went down. This isn't just a history lesson. It's a roller coaster ride through the ingenuity, desperation, and sheer brainpower of wartime engineers. We'll explore four key examples, some true, some not, where the Germans allegedly borrowed from Soviet designs. I've dug deep into the archives, scoured the web, and even checked out what folks are saying on X to make sure we're getting the full picture. Plus, I'll throw in some economic context to show why these decisions made sense, or didn't, and share my thoughts on what it all means. Ready to uncover the truth? Let's jump in. World War II wasn't just about battles. It was a high-stakes tech race where every nation pushed their engineers to the limit. Tanks, planes, and guns were evolving faster than you could say blitzkrieg. When one side got their hands on the enemy's gear, they'd tear it apart to see what made it tick. If it was better than their own, they'd either copy it, adapt it, or steal the concept to save time and money. This wasn't cheating, it was survival. The Soviets, for example, weren't shy about borrowing from the Germans. Their famous 45 anti-tank gun, the M42, was based on a German Pak-36, which the USSR licensed before the war. But did it ever go the other way? Did Nazi Germany ever swipe ideas from the Red Army? If you Google this, you'll find a ton of articles claiming the Germans were practically photocopying Soviet blueprints left and right. But is that true? I've sifted through the noise, fact-checked the claims, and pieced together the real story. Some of these so-called copies are straight-up myths, while others are legit examples of wartime borrowing. We're going to break down four big ones, separate fact from fiction, and throw in some economic analysis to see what made sense in the chaos of war. Plus, I'll share my take on why this matters and what we can learn from it. Let's get started. Myth 1. Did the Germans steal sloped armor from the T-34? One of the biggest myths out there is that the Germans copied the sloped armor of the Soviet T-34 tank for their Panther. The T-34 was a game-changer when it hit the battlefield in 1941, with its angled armor that could deflect shells like nobody's business. So, did the Germans just rip it off? Let's dig in. The origins of sloped armor. Sloped armor wasn't a Soviet invention. The idea of angling armor plates to increase protection goes way back to World War I. Take the Russian Russo-Balt Type C armored car from 1914 or the German Benz armored rail car. They both use slope plates. French tanks like the Renault FT from the interwar years also rocked this design. Sloping the armor increases its effective thickness, making it harder to penetrate without adding extra weight. But there's a catch. It shrinks the tank's interior space, so you either end up with a cramped crew or a bigger, heavier tank. T-34 versus Panther, a closer look. The T-34 and the German PZ, KPFW, had similar-sized fighting compartments, engines, and transmissions. But the Panther, with its sloped armor, ended up a whole yard longer and half a yard wider to keep the interior roomy. Here's the kicker. Sloped armor doesn't save weight. Basic geometry tells us that a sloped plate, while thinner, is longer, so its cross-sectional area, and thus its weight, is the same as a vertical plate of equal protection. The Germans knew this and often stuck with thicker vertical armor when it made sense, balancing protection with production costs. The economic angle. In wartime, Every ounce of steel counts. Sloped armor is a trade-off. It boosts protection without adding weight, but it complicates manufacturing and requires more materials for a larger hull. Germany's economy was stretched thin by 1943, producing about 5,500 tanks that year while facing steel and fuel shortages. The Panther's design was a calculated choice to maximize protection while keeping the tank mobile. Meanwhile, the Soviets churned out T-34s like hotcakes, over 35,000 by war's end, thanks to their massive industrial base in the Urals. Sloped armor helped the Soviets save on materials, but for Germany, it was just one tool in the toolbox. My take: I think the idea that the Germans copied the T-34 sloped armor is overblown. They were already familiar with the concept and just adapted it to their needs. The T-34 definitely made them rethink their tank designs, but calling it a straight-up copy is a stretch. It's more like a case of parallel evolution in engineering. What do you think? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Truth 2. The Gür 43 rifle, inspired by the Soviet SVT-40. Now, let's talk about a real case of borrowing. The German Gür 43 rifle, which took a page straight out of the Soviet SVT-40's playbook. The backstory: before World War II, the German army, Wehrmacht, wasn't big on semi-automatic rifles. Their infantry relied on MG-34 machine guns backed by soldiers with bolt-action Mauser K98K rifles. But as the war dragged on, it became clear that their troops needed more firepower to keep up. In 1940, the Wehrmacht put out a call for a semi-auto rifle. Two companies, Mauser and Walther, came up with the G41M and G41W, but both were flops, clunky, unreliable, and a pain to produce. Enter the SVT-40. The Soviet SVT-40, designed by Fyodor Tokarev, was a different story. Captured in droves during 1941, this semi-auto rifle was simpler, more reliable, and could spit out rounds faster than anything the Germans had. The folks at Walther took one look and said, "Why reinvent the wheel?" They copied the SVT-40's gas-operated system and bolt design, and by 1943, the Gür 43 was born. The Germans cranked out about 400,000 of these rifles before the war ended, a huge leap forward for their infantry. The economic side: in 1943, Germany was feeling the pinch. Resources were scarce, and the Eastern Front was bleeding them dry. Developing a new rifle from scratch would have taken years and millions of Reichsmarks. Copying the SVT-40's design saved both. A Gür 43 cost about 150 Reichsmarks to produce, roughly the same as a Mauser K98K, but it packed way more punch. For comparison, the US M1 Garand, another semi-auto rifle, cost about $85, around 340 Reichsmarks at the time, but the Germans didn't have the luxury of America's industrial might. My take: this is a textbook case of wartime pragmatism. The SVT-40 was a rock star, and the Germans were smart to borrow its best features. Honestly, I'm surprised they didn't copy more Soviet designs like this. Maybe their pride got in the way, or maybe their bureaucracy slowed things down. What's your take? Let me know in the comments. Myth 3. Did the Germans copy the T-34's wide tracks? Another common claim is that the Germans stole the idea of wide tank tracks from the T-34 to boost their tank's mobility. Let's see if this holds up. Why wide tracks matter. Wide tracks spread a tank's weight over a larger area, reducing ground pressure and helping it navigate mud, snow, or soft terrain. The downside? Wider tracks add weight and drag, especially when turning. Engineers have to find the sweet spot. The T-34's 20-inch wide tracks were perfect for its 26-ton frame, giving it solid mobility. German tanks like the PZ, KPFW 3 and 4, which were lighter, used 16-inch tracks with similar ground pressure. The Panther's tracks. When the Germans rolled out the heavier Panther, 44.8 tons, they bumped the track width to 24 inches. But this wasn't a T-34 ripoff. The Panther's ground pressure, 0.88 kilograms per square centimeter, was close to the T-34-85's, 0.83 kilograms per square centimeter. Despite the weight difference, it was just good engineering, not copying. For comparison, the Soviet KV-1 tank, 47.5 tons, had 26-inch tracks, while the Panthers were 24 inches, pretty close for similar weights. The economic angle. Wide tracks meant more steel, which was a big deal for Germany's war economy. By 1944, steel shortages were crippling their production, with only about 6,000 Panthers built compared to the USSR's 14,000 T-34s. The Soviets had access to vast resources in the Urals, letting them churn out tanks with wide tracks en masse. For Germany, every extra inch of track width had to be worth it. My take: I don't buy the idea that the Germans copied the T-34's tracks. They were pros at tank design and knew how to optimize for mobility. The T-34 may have pushed them to think harder, but wide tracks were a standard solution, not a Soviet exclusive. What's your opinion? Hit the comments. Truth 4. The Pak-36R anti-tank gun. Repurposed Soviet F-22. Here's another legit example of German borrowing. The 7.62 centimeters Pak-36R anti-tank gun, nicknamed the Cobra by Soviet tankers for its deadly bite. The F-22's story. The Soviet F-22, designed by Vasily Grabin, was a divisional artillery piece captured in huge numbers, about 1,500, in 1941. At the time, the Germans were struggling with their anti-tank guns. Their Pak-36 couldn't handle T-34s or KV tanks, and the new Pak-40 wasn't ready yet. So they turned to the F-22. How they revamped it. The Germans didn't just use the F-22 as is. They bored out the chamber for a more powerful charge, added a muzzle brake, upgraded the recoil system, and moved the controls to one side for easier aiming. They also lowered the gun's elevation to focus on anti-tank roles and fitted a smaller shield on towed versions. The result? The Pak-36R, a beast that could knock out any Soviet tank. They converted about 560 for towing and 900 for self-propelled guns. The economic win. This was a genius move. Converting an F-22 cost just 10% of a new gun's price, about 1,200 Reichsmarks versus 12,000 for a Pak-40. This let the Germans bolster their defenses on a budget, critical when resources were tight. The USSR, with its massive production capacity, could afford to build new guns, but Germany had to get creative. My take: this is a masterclass in wartime resourcefulness. The Germans took a solid Soviet design and made it their own, saving time and money. I'm honestly impressed they didn't try to mass-produce it from scratch, but maybe the captured stock running out put a stop to that. What do you think? Let's hear it in the comments. Truth 5. The Granatwerfer 42 mortar, straight from the Soviet PM-38. Another clear case of borrowing is the German 12 cm Granatwerfer 42 mortar, based on the Soviet PM-38. The PM-38's legacy. The Soviet 120 mm PM-38 mortar was a star performer. Simple, reliable, and devastating. In 1941, the Germans captured hundreds of them, along with full design and production documents in occupied Kharkov. They loved it so much they decided to make their own, copying the blueprint. The Germans didn't mess around. They took the PM-38's plans and started production at their factories. The only change was swapping the crank handle for a disc-shaped one. The Granatwerfer 42 was basically a carbon copy, and for 1943, they built about 8,500 units. The economic side. Making a Granatwerfer 42 cost around 2,000 Reichsmarks, comparable to other light artillery. For a Germany strapped for cash and materials in 1943, this was a cheap way to boost firepower. The Soviets, meanwhile, produced about 30,000 PM-38s, thanks to their industrial juggernaut. My take: the Granatwerfer 42 shows how practical the Germans could be. The PM 38 was a winner, and they knew it. I'm just surprised they didn't jump on mortars like this sooner. Maybe they underestimated their power early on? What's your guess? Drop it in the comments. Myth 6. Was the Panther 8T-34 knockoff? One of the most persistent myths is that the German Panther tank was a copy of the T-34. Let's break it down. Design differences. Sure, the Panther and T-34 both have sloped armor, but that's where the similarities end. The Panther, built by man, is pure German engineering: front-mounted transmission, rear engine, and a torsion bar suspension with staggered road wheels. The T-34, on the other hand, has a rear engine and Christie suspension. A rival design by Daimler-Benz did look more like the T-34, with a diesel engine and rear drive, but it was rejected. The economic picture. Building a Panther was pricey, about 130,000 Reichsmarks, nearly double the T-34's cost, around 70,000 rubles. Germany bet on quality, producing about 6,000 Panthers by 1944, while the Soviets pumped out 14,000 T-34s, prioritizing quantity. Different strategies, different outcomes. My take: the T-34 definitely spooked the Germans, but the Panther was no copy. It was their answer to the T-34, built on their own terms. Calling it a ripoff is lazy. It's more about inspiration than imitation. Agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments. Truth 7. The German Katyusha, Raketen Vielfachwerfer. Finally, let's talk about the German 8 cm Raketen Vielfachwerfer, a direct descendant of the Soviet BM-8 Katyusha. The Katyusha's impact. The Soviet BM-8 and BM-13 Katyusha rocket launchers were terrifying, raining destruction on German lines. Despite myths that no Katyushas were captured, the Germans got their hands on several in working order by 1942. They were so impressed they ordered a copycat version, and by 1943, Czech engineers at Česká Zbrojovka delivered. How they copied it. The Raketen Vielfachwerfer was a near-exact replica of the BM-8, with rail-type guides and 78mm fin-stabilized rockets. The Germans tweaked it, though. Angled stabilizers gave the rocket spin for better accuracy, and they used their own fuel and ignition systems. The result? Their Wurfgranit spring rocket outperformed the Soviet RS-82. The economic catch. Despite its awesomeness, the Raketen Vielfachwerfer didn't go big. Only about 15,000 rockets were made, and it armed just a few SS batteries. Why? The German Nebelwerfer, a cheaper rocket launcher, cost about 300 Reichsmarks per salvo versus 500 rubles for a Katyusha. Economics won out. My take: this is the coolest example of German borrowing. They didn't just copy the Katyusha, they made it better in some ways. But not mass-producing it feels like a missed opportunity. Maybe resources were too tight, or the Nebelwerfer was just easier to crank out. What do you think? Share your thoughts below. Conclusion: what history teaches us. The story of German borrowing from the Red Army is a wild mix of pragmatism, ingenuity, and busted myths. World War II showed that ideas don't care about borders. Even enemies can learn from each other. Sloped armor and wide tracks? Not copies, just smart engineering. Butzegewehr 43, PAK 36, Granatwerfer 42, Endraketenvielfachwerfer. Those are the real deal. Proof that the Germans saw gold in Soviet designs and weren't afraid to use it.